What is up, people? Welcome back to the Pragmatic Guide to Building Muscle. This is going to be the final video in this series. After covering progression in the last week's video, I thought it would be important to tie all this together with all the variables listed out, go through some specific recommendations for all of them, and then also how we need to think about this going forward and tying this into a program that you can make for yourself. Because ultimately at the end of the day, it's not necessarily just considering the variables that's going to lead us to gaining the muscle that we want, but it's also understanding the constraints which are going to help guide us in regards to making that decision in regards to which variables that we do tweak. So if this is the first video in the series that you've stumbled upon, I'd highly recommend that you go back and check out the earlier videos, because I'm not going to go into the same level of nuance between all these training variables as I did within their own separate videos. But today I'm going to get you to think about how all of these variables are interacting alongside the constraints and alongside actually achieving our goal. But before we get into going through the variables and going through all of the recommended ranges, which I use within my own coaching practice, I want us to refresh our memory on our decision filter. This decision filter is how we are looking at our training and using this to help us make effective decisions that are going to lead to muscle gain. So first and foremost, is it specific to our muscle building goals? Is it progressible? Can we achieve overload with the setup that we're using? Is it repeatable and is it enjoyable? Is it likely that we're going to be able to sustain this for a long period of time? And finally, is it actually effective? Is there proof, whether in the research, whether from anecdotal evidence, that what you are doing does actually lead to muscle growth, so you're not wasting your time? So the goal of our training is to achieve a direct stimulus to the muscle that we're looking to train. This stimulus involves gaining a high level of mechanical tension. Now, for this mechanical tension to translate into actual muscle growth, we need to balance the tension, the stimulus, with fatigue and also with recovery. This is what we're trying to achieve through optimizing our training variables and through working within our constraints. And you can see just from everything I've listed out here, right, all of the constraints, there's so much variability between person to person in where they're going to fall within any of these. Personally, one of my biggest gripes with the optimal training scene that we see on social media these days, it is giving blanket recommendations to a population that are not homogenous. No two individuals are really the same. For sure, can there be general abilities in regards to what we respond to? But ultimately, if you're looking to personalize a training program and you really want to have something to fit you, you have to understand that optimal for you is going to look different to optimal for me. I have a pretty fine setup of my life, right? I work as an online coach. I work for myself. I can dedicate as much time to the gym as I realistically want. However, some of the guys that I coach, their dads, they can maybe only train 3 times a week. Some of them are coming to me with an injury history. Maybe some of them are coming to me at different stages within a journey. They're a different training age. All of this dictates how I program for them. And this is something for you to be very wary of when you're looking at social media and you see people give these blanket recommendations for specific amount of sets you should do, specific exercises you should do. You have to ask yourself, is that for you? Or is that just the content creator telling you what works for them? Or maybe what they have read in a research paper with limited application to your specific population. Optimal is very much a moving target. And what is optimal when you are in your early days of training can change as you get to the advanced stage. And it can change depending on just your life setup, right? Depending on different stresses that come into your life, different responsibilities that take place. I try to get my clients, and this is the way I think about it myself, not to think about, am I doing everything as optimally as possible? Because I will never truly know. There's always going to be some new information that comes out and some different way of thinking that's going to be presented to you that's going to cause you to second guess your approach. This is just shiny object syndrome. You will start to tweak things too often. And what happens then is you're never truly consistent with one approach for a long enough period of time to actually see if what you're doing is working. Because if you change too many variables at once, it's hard to know which of those variables was actually moving the dial. So what I really hone in on, as opposed to am I doing everything optimally, I like to ask myself, is what I'm doing working for me right now? Am I seeing tangible progress with it? Am I seeing my loads increasing within the gym? Am I getting stronger? That's a performance metric, which could indicate there's some muscle growth happening underneath the hood. Are my visuals looking different? When I take my progress pictures and I assess them over a period of time, do they seem to be improving? Does it look like when I reach the same body weight in my next diet phase or in my next push-up phase, does that body weight look like there's more muscle mass and less body fat? When I take measurement circumferences, can I see that my limbs are increasing while my waist is potentially decreasing? This could be a good indication of recomp. So these are the things that we want to actually be measuring in regards to our outcomes to see if the process is actually working for us. Because if we never have any type of measurement process, it's very difficult for us to discern whether what we're doing is actually effective and if the variables are set up in line with the constraints and they're actually achieving the goal. So now that that part's out of the way, let's talk about our variables. Our variables are the things that we need to do in order for us to grow, okay? They are the backbone of the program. They are setting the structure, how hard we train, how often we train, what exercise we pick. Now, to give us a summary of what we went through in all the preceding videos, we probably want to start at the big three. So starting off with intensity and effort. So intensity and effort, essentially these are just the magnitude of the stimulus. We want to ensure that we're getting towards a close proximity to failure to ensure we're getting a sufficient level of stimulus to achieve mechanical tension within our sets. Now, this from the video we discussed is going to be 0 to 4 reps in reserve. So that's 0 to 4 reps away from failure. Now, when we think about volume is the dose of the stimulus, okay? So we have the magnitude and we have the dose. So to achieve a good level of muscularity and to try to optimize, we ideally want to be working within something that's going to give us about 8 to 20 sets per muscle per week, okay? And then as we move on to frequency is how we are going to distribute this dose across the week. And ideally, we want to be hitting our muscle 2 to 3 times per week. And then we move on to our exercise selection. Exercise selection is the delivery vehicle of the stimulus. Magnitude, dose, distribution, delivery. So our exercise selection should be dictated by our priorities within our training in regards to what particular areas that we want to grow. And the exercise we pick should ideally be exercises that put that target muscle group as the limiting factor within the exercise. After we've assessed what the delivery vehicle of the stimulus is, we need to decide how our exercises will be ordered within the session. So we discussed in the exercise order video that this is not as important as the preceding variables, but it still does have some importance. So similar to the exercise selection, we probably want to have our priority movements at the start of the session or our harder, higher skill movements early in the session, but ultimately there could be a lot of variability within this. The most important thing when it does come to exercise order is ensuring that you're balancing the stimulus alongside fatigue in the session. So you want to ensure the exercise order is set up in a way that by the time you get to your last exercise, that you still have juice to go. So you can ensure that those final few sets, those final few exercises are still highly effective. So in essence, this is our opportunity within the session to balance the stimulus with the fatigue from every other exercise that could interfere with the next particular movement. And then we have our two quality control factors, our tempo and our rest periods. We discussed in the tempo video how we really want to think about our tempo as just a way to standardize our repetitions. So we want to ensure that we have somewhat of a control eccentric and we're not just letting gravity do its job. We're trying to ensure that the muscle is the thing that's taking control of the movement. And we want to ensure that the concentric, the lifting phase, is explosive. And if we do this, we can ensure across the set that we're going to be giving ourselves the best opportunity to get the high quality stimulus that we need to ultimately achieve sufficient mechanical tension and get reps that help us grow. Our rest times should be set up in a way that's going to allow us to perform our next set with the same level of effort as we did the preceding set. And this can be in a range of 2 to 5 minutes depending on the exercise. More demanding movements that are potentially using a lot of different muscle groups, multi-joint movements for example, these could be exercises where we lean towards the higher end of that spectrum. Whereas we have things like maybe single arm work, for example, maybe we only need 2 minutes rest, or even smaller muscle groups like your side delts, for example. And finally, we have our progression. So all of this is not really that important if we don't have some type of progression scheme in place, whether that's using our single progression method, or we're just looking at changing one variable over time, whether that's just increasing load, for example, or even if you're really, really new to the gym and potentially just increasing reps up to a certain point could help. And then we look at double progression being the one where we're looking to increase reps within a rep range, say 6 to 10. Once you hit 10 reps, you add load the following week and start back at the bottom of the barrel. And then this progression loop can just continue on and on and on for a very long period of time before you really need to rethink your strategy. And then the final point on progression was the triple progression scheme, which could just be used for very, very small muscle groups or stubborn muscle groups where you may not see a great rate of progression over even a couple of months of time. So this is one that I mentioned that I use very sparingly, and I'm going to lean closer to using double 9 times out of 10. Okay, so we have a nice summary of all our variables now. So intensity and effort, or proximity to failure, 0 to 4 reps in reserve, volume 8 to 20 sets per muscle per week, frequency, hit the muscle 2 to 3 times per week, exercise selection, priority body parts, picking exercises where that muscle is going to be the limiting factor within the exercise. Exercise order is just a case of balancing stimulus and physique, whichever way allows you to do that best, that's the way you do it. Tempo, control, the eccentric, standardized repetitions, explosive concentric, rest period 2 to 5 minutes, progression schemes, single, double, triple, leading closer to double most of the time if your goal is building muscle. So this is everything here, right? Now, all these variables, they do ultimately impact one another, right? Like if we have a higher amount of volume, that can impact your ability to train at a high level of intensity, especially if you're early on, right? And especially if these constraints are not aligned, right? So now that we went through all our variables, we need to understand the constraints, because the variables are how we set up the program and like what we think about when we're setting up the program, but the constraints are going to dictate what exact frameworks that we actually lean towards, like what side of these spectrums that we go within. So let's go through them one by one. So we have our training age. So training age is going to be beginner, intermediate, advanced. And this is not down to how long you've been going to the gym. It's down to your potential, right? Your muscle gain potential. Somebody who's in the beginner stage, they still have a high amount of muscle gain potential. They could be in the gym for 5-10 years, but still be nowhere near because the variables are just not aligned with what would be an effective training program. Maybe it's just something as simple as they're not adherent, right? But this is going to be a lot of people who go to the gym. Then we have the intermediates. Intermediates are gone past the newbie stage. They have a lot of these correct, but they still maybe have some things within their life that are constraining them from reaching that advanced stage. And then we have advanced guys, right? The advanced guys, you know them if you see them. They're the guy in the gym that you look up to, right? They're the guy in the gym that you would ask questions, or the person who has an absurd level of muscle mass, absurd level of strength that just stands out from the general population. When you get to this stage, you likely have a lot of this shit optimized, right? And then you're essentially limited by the rest of these constraints. And these people, they don't have a huge amount to go in regards to how much more muscle they're going to gain, but they can look at finally tweaking these to ensure that they continue to make steps forward. And you can look at the progress of any elite natural bodybuilder to get some insight as to how they go about it. And what you'll actually find is a lot of them have different approaches, because again, we're all slightly different, even though there is going to be some similarities. So a beginner is going to struggle getting to 0 reps in reserve. They're going to struggle getting to that really high level of intensity where the muscle itself is the thing that failed to set. Maybe before that fails, their technique fails. And with this, maybe they need more sets to ingrain the actual skill of that movement pattern, as well as to make up for the fact that they're not getting as much of these stimulating reps. Having said that, the person who is at that stage also likely has a low tolerance to training volume. So they probably don't need a ton more extra sets. But we could look at this through the lens of within a session, right? They may have 3, maybe 4 sets on an exercise, because doing 1 to 2 sets is not giving them enough practice. It's not giving them enough opportunity to get to these very effective reps. But then within that, if they're doing 3 to 4 sets, and then we're also looking at other aspects of our constraints, maybe time availability, well, this maybe condenses down our exercise selection. Maybe our exercise selection is a lot more simplistic. Or even within exercise selection, maybe we actually regress some movements so they're not as skill dominant, and maybe put them on more machines so that they can have the muscle being the limiting factor. Now, if that's the case, well, maybe they need less sets for an exercise. So you can see how already, just by looking at training age and time availability, we may now also look at arranging these variables in different order and thinking about making different decisions. And if we stick with just time availability, maybe they are not going all the way up to 5 minutes, okay? Maybe they're going closer to the 2, because this is allowing them to fit within their time availability that they have within the gym. That's allowing them to get in the quality work. Because we can set all these up in like the most optimal way possible, but if it's not leading to setting within this person's time availability, they're not going to adhere. And if they can't adhere, then it doesn't matter how optimal all these things are. If we look at the other end of the spectrum and we look at our advanced trainees, they have a good ability to push towards 0 reps in reserve or a high level of intensity. Now within this, you might say then, well, maybe they require less sets. Maybe. But this is where other areas of constraints come in. Some advanced trainees will be able to train to a high level of intensity on every set they do in the training session. They may have a high workload tolerance. Maybe they're coming into the gym from having a background in playing like elite level sport. If they're coming from that background, I bet you that they will be able to do a lot of work before they really feel as if they are wiped out from fatigue. These people could potentially be looking at pushing towards these higher levels of sets while maintaining a good level of training intensity. On the opposite side of things, we might look at advanced trainees who have some injury history. Maybe we are looking at those who have a lower recovery capacity because maybe lifestyle stress. Now with that, they might look at the lower end of the volume spectrum and say, okay, well, I only need to do 8 sets because I've got this other thing outside the gym, maybe job, family, whatever it may be, that's eating up a lot of the recovery capacity. And they find that when they do, on the lower end of the volume spectrum per week, that they still get a good level of growth. And if they push beyond that, it wouldn't work as well. And I think this is, again, is a reason to look at advanced level natural bodybuilders, because a lot of them will do varying amounts of volume, right? You'll have the likes of Eric Helms, he was on the podcast recently. He's doing like well over 20 sets per muscle group per week, and he's putting on size as an advanced trainee. We have Dirk Emmerich, who was on my podcast also recently. He was talking about on his quads and his arms, he's doing 20 sets per week. But on other muscle groups, the volume is a little bit lower. They're advanced level bodybuilders. They are at the top of their sport and they're progressing on these high volumes. But then you look at maybe other advanced trainees, like Jeff Albers, for example, his volume, it's a lot lower. And these are just things that we need to consider. They're both in different scenarios. So you see already, even with the level of training that you're at, they're still going to be operated within some of these constraints here. An advanced lifter, for example, maybe even their volume tolerance is lower because of injury history. Maybe it's lower because of time availability. They have a job, they have a family, which limits the amount of volume they can realistically do. Maybe they have a higher ceiling for which they could get benefit from, but just due to their constraints, they're not able to do it. So they have to operate within the constraints and operate within a framework for their volume that's going to allow them to still make some progress. It may not be 100% optimal, but you can only optimize within your constraints. When we look at recovery capacity, depending on how frequently quads recover, how quickly your chest recovers, whatever it may be, that will dictate, do you do 2 times a week or 3 times a week? If you have a priority body part, or if you have a body part that's really, really strong, maybe you go even below this, maybe go to 1 time per week, right? I have a client, Connor, who has humongous quads, and I have him only doing 1 day of quads per week because that's all he needs. They're big enough. We need to bring up the rest of his physique. So with the likes of his delts, with the likes of his chest, with the likes of his back, we're going up towards 3 times a week frequency because that's specific to him. That's specific to his training age. That's specific towards his own individual makeup. And it's also dictated by his time availability too. How often he can go to the gym and his recovery capacity. How often he can hit those body parts with the same level of effort and get more out of it. And then also that's going to dictate the amount of volume he can do, right? Frequency is going to increase typically the amount of volume that we're going to be able to accumulate throughout a week. But frequency is just one of these places that we have to look at when we're considering recovery capacity. We also need to think about, can we always train to 0 reps in reserve? Is that realistic for you? Is that going to promote the best way for us to balance recovery and to ensure that we're getting good effective stimulus that's actually leading towards growth over the long term? Or for you, is it going to be better for you to keep a couple of reps in the tank? And that allows you to balance fatigue much more readily. are the exercises we're choosing right now sending us into a hole every single time we train, which is also going to be dictated by our volume, intensity, and frequency. But if we're picking exercises that frequently put us in a position where we are always having to recover, and we're not quite ready to attack the next session with the same level of effort, then exercise selection may need to be changed towards picking exercises which are higher stimulus, but a little bit lower in fatigue. And we talked about that in the exercise selection video. But maybe the person who has a lower recovery capacity, they maybe need the 5 minutes rest between a lot of sets. That is something that can be sorted by actually improving cardio health. But the person who has a really high recovery capacity, maybe they feel they don't need that 5 minutes rest. Maybe they slide towards the 2 minutes on that scale, because that's all they need to perform the next set with the highest level of intensity possible for them. And then we look at lifestyle habits. If you have good sleep, good stress management, your nutrition's on point, you may be able to operate at the highest level of volume, with the highest level of intensity, train as frequently as possible. If you're not, maybe you need to slide towards the opposite end of that scale. If you have poor sleep, poor stress management, your nutrition's not great, maybe you need less volume because you're not going to recover as effectively. Maybe you can't hit a muscle group as frequently. Maybe you do need more rest between sets. Maybe you do need to be a bit more cautious about what exercise you're putting in because you're not able to tolerate some movements with such a high level of fatigue that comes after them. Lifestyle habits ultimately dictate your recovery capacity. So if these are off, this is also going to factor in how we should be thinking about balancing all of our variables. So a big constraint here is going to be your injury history. So depending on how you're presenting to the gym, it's going to very much dictate things like intensity, volume, frequency, exercise selection, where you place particular exercise within a session, the tempo you use, the rest times, even what type of modality you use, whether that's blood flow restriction, for example. Now, when we're working around an injury, we want to ask ourselves, what exercises, first and foremost, are going to be driving pain the most? Is there a way that we can still train that particular muscle group, whether that's going to be adjusting the resistance profile, whether that's putting the joint in a different position, using a different grip? What way is going to allow us to still deliver a stimulus towards that target tissue? After that, we need to ask ourselves the intensity. What is the level of loading or the proximity to failure that is still going to be tolerable without delivering more pain? And then within that, how much volume does the area seem to be able to tolerate right now? And after we've decided all those, then we need to ask ourselves, okay, what type of level of control do we need to use here? Is it so bad that we need to ensure that we're using it tempo on the concentric, which is a common exercise prescription if people are looking to work around pain, is actually moving the weight on the concentric to lifting phase a little bit slower than intentional? Well, these are all the variables that we need to consider when we're looking to work around that injury so we can overcome it and get back to regular training. Equipment available is a big one, right? Not every single gym is going to be kitted out with all the prime kit where you can adjust the resistance profile. Some of it is going to be kitted out with shitty techno gym equipment where they just feel, for the most part, shit. And with that, you need to decide, is that movement that I want to put in the plan, or could I pick a free weight movement or just a cable movement that does the job even better? But that's also when something like equipment availability links in with training age, and where training age is then also going to link with the likes of volume, effort, frequency. Or think about equipment available, if somebody's a beginner and they're coming in and they have access to just a barbell and plates, well then that person may have to do a more condensed amount of exercises, more compound based exercises that are going to allow them to meet their goals from an actual stimulus delivery point of view. But maybe now they need to do more sets to get more practice at the actual movement itself so they get better and they're able to actually drive a high quality stimulus over time, and they're able to get closer to these higher proximities to failure. But maybe you do go to a super gym where you have access to every single piece of equipment that you could ever ask for. And this just opens up the door for exercise selection and really being able to hone in on exercises which are going to be truly, truly effective for you and have the target muscle being the limiting factor. That itself could be an area where you look at manipulating volume a little bit more. Maybe now, because you have these perfectly aligned exercises and perfectly aligned machines, that you can deliver a good quality level stimulus with a lower amount of sets. Time availability. We need to ask ourselves, within the time that we have within the gym, how much work do we need to actually grow? How much work is going to be effective? And what can we reasonably fit within this actual training session? Maybe where our exercise selection, you pick exercises which have a lower amount of warm-ups that you need to do. So an example here could be versus using a leg press, maybe use a pendulum squat because you don't have to load as many plates on it. And you pick that also ahead of doing like a barbell squat, which maybe you need to do extra mobility so you actually achieve a good level of depth, good level of range of motion. Maybe you need more focused sets so you can get your balance correct and get your bar pack correct and really kind of nail the likes of your bracing within the exercise. And also something like a barbell squat relative to the pendulum, you're still going to get a good level of intensity, but one of them is maybe going to be a little bit more direct in regards to stimulus with the guided path of motion. But again, that all comes down to as well the equipment available that you do have. So we need to consider all these constraints together. But time availability doesn't just affect exercise selection and maybe movements that we pick that are going to be requiring a little bit less warm-ups, but it's all going to dictate how much volume we can do within the session or per a particular exercise. It may push us towards doing more high intensity, low volume type work. It might push us towards training more frequently because within the actual session, we're not able to get in as much volume. So we want to distribute that more across the week and go up towards higher training frequencies. We could also consider exercise order within our time availability. Maybe we decide at the start of the session, we do more isolation based movements because these are going to be ones where we don't have to load up a huge amount of weight on the bar or on a machine. Maybe we just use some select rise pin loaded machines where we are going to have quick changeovers in weights. But then that also means by the time we get to maybe some bigger compound movements at the end of our session, we don't need to again load up as many plates onto the bar or onto the machine. And this is allowing us to ultimately balance our stimulus and fatigue across session, but also pay heed to how much time we have available within the gym. But within the exercise order, we can also maybe look at things like supersets that are going to allow us to condense more total workload into a shorter period of time to still fit within the parameters of our time. We have psychology. Psychology is super important, and this is probably one of the more underrated components of making a program. If I have somebody who comes to me and I'm reading their questionnaire and they're saying that like they've trained lower volume, they love doing that, they love just getting into the gym, getting that after it, and going balls to the wall, I'm not going to give them high volume, far away from failure type training, right? Maybe they could do with that just for a bit of kind of change, a bit of novelty. But if what they've been doing has been working and they are looking just to have maybe other aspects of the approach, other variables tweaked in line with where they want to go, or maybe it's just something other than their training really needs to be completely optimized and tweaked for, maybe it's something outside of the gym, maybe lifestyle habits need to be optimized. Well, then I need to play into that person's psychology. What do they really enjoy doing when they're in the gym? And how can I set up the variables in a way that's going to be effective for them and get them to have some new progress take place? But we also have to consider the psychology of people who are maybe new to the gym environment. They're typically coming in with a mindset where they're maybe thinking about, am I going to get hurt? Am I going to make a fool of myself on all of these machines, which I don't know how to use? And that can very much dictate where we set all these up, right? Maybe we make their exercise selection really simplistic and hard to mess up. Maybe we ease them into a session with exercises that feel comfortable and feel enjoyable before we get onto more of the harder exercise, right? Particularly if you're programming split squats in for people, right? Or single leg work, which most people don't enjoy. But maybe we guide them into it, right? We hide the vegetables in the sauce. Or we look at the intensity and effort, right? If they're seeing big guys in the gym screaming, right, because they're pushing to such high levels of intensity, that can be a bit off-putting. Maybe they don't want to be that person. And maybe they don't need to be that person just yet, because a lot of the time, anything they're going to do is going to lead to some type of growth once it's within these ranges. And we just get them to work within a couple of reps away from failure. We get them to do as many sets as they can tolerate and they can actually concentrate for. And then that's what we build upon, right? That's like their starting place, because ultimately a beginner, they have a long way to go, right? But a lot of things they can do can be quite effective. So we need to play into the psychology of that person who comes into the gym, who has no experience, what they are expecting of the process to be like, and ensure that we are setting up our variables in line with what their expectations are, what they will enjoy, and what will ultimately for them lead to adherence. Because if you put a beginner through an absolutely miserable session, something that an advanced trainee would like love to be getting into, like a fucking mad hard leg day, they are not going to show up the next day, right? They're not going to show up the next week. They're going to say, that was awful and I don't enjoy that. That's not what I had envisioned for my training journey. You give them more time. You give them more opportunities to progress their loads, work up towards PBs. You give them more opportunities to practice a movement and practice a skill and get better at squatting, for example. Little bits of pushing to that place, pushing really, really close to failure. And over time, their psychology can begin to shift. And they'll get to that point where they now have gotten to the intermediate stage and now they're really starting to enjoy training hard. So this is an overlooked part of coaching, and it's an overlooked part of programming, and something that I really play into when I'm working with beginners. Biomechanics, your torso length, your limb lengths, they can all dictate every single variable here, right? Somebody who is going to be maybe a bit stockier, they've shorter arms, big rib cage, this person could probably handle a high amount of volume when we're doing something like a press, right? They are probably going to be able to do a lot of load there, they're going to be able to do a lot of volume, and they're going to be able to do a lot of frequency. Somebody with the opposite type of presentation, shallow rib cage, long arms, the amount of distance the bar needs to travel now, maybe they get higher amounts of fatigue from the same exercise. The same amount of sets, that crushes them. So this is an area where we need to consider how we're presenting in the gym. And you just really pick this up from when you're doing standard movements in the gym. You're doing a bench press, you're doing a squat, you're doing a deadlift. How that exercise feel for you is important, right? You need to play into that, because like you will hear quite often people say, you know, bench press rest my shoulders, and you see them and they're, again, long gangly arms, very shallow rib cage. They're not even like having their technique is whatever, right? They could have good technique and they're still just like not feeling this exercise clicking for them. This is a situation where we say, let's just pick a better exercise. But also, if we're going to do that movement, we need to be cognizant of the amount of frequency we do. We need to be cognizant of the intensity or volume we need to do. Similarly, if you have somebody who has very short arms, they have a long torso and short limbs, that person might find that when they do hinge-based patterns or deadlift type patterns, that they get beat up very, very easily. Now, if we're looking to train their hamstrings, their glutes, maybe we just, again, pick a better exercise. Or when we're programming in hinge type work, we just consider the amount of intensity we do, the amount of volume we do, the amount of frequency. So we see here, just through two different body types, how there can be a change up in these variables, and why there can't be just one program for every single person on the planet, because we're all built differently, never mind the rest of the constraints. And finally, amongst all of this, all of these constraints, adherence rules. If we can't adhere, this is not going to be achieved, right? We can achieve it in one session, but we may not be able to achieve it over a long period of time, which is really what matters, right? It doesn't matter how optimized all these variables are. If we're not adhering to the program for a long enough period of time, we're not going to gain muscle, okay? And this, in essence, is why optimal is a lie. So we need to consider what is allowing us to adhere. And quite often, what's allowing us to adhere is this, right? Is it specific to our goals? Is the training progressible? Is it repeatable and enjoyable? And is it effective? If we have all these sorted out, adherence will be no issue, especially if we're considering all of these constraints within how we are programming our variables. So that is that for this video and for this series. I really hope you did enjoy this video. It's a little more of a thinking cap one, but if you can walk away with this video having a better ability to think when you are looking to put a program down on paper, whether that's for yourself, whether that's for your clients, this series and this video has done its job. I understand it's not sexy and it's not like completely direct in saying you should do this. As I said from the outset of the series, I want to give you a lens to think through versus a one approach, because the one approach just doesn't work, right? We're all different. Hope you did enjoy the series. If you did, please consider giving me a like. Subscribe if you haven't already. I'm on the road to 1,000. I want to get there soon. I want to get there this year for sure, because I've been trying for a while. And yeah, if you have any questions, leave comments. If you have any of your own thoughts in regards to anything I didn't mention, please leave them below. Love to hear them. And we will catch you in the next series, which whatever that is. If you have any ideas, leave them in the comments and I will start working on them. That's it. Talk soon.